People follow leaders because they think and act differently. Effective leaders have certain and specific differences that make them someone people want to follow. Let's look at how they're different and how we measure it using the GreyScale assessment. What makes a leader effective is healthy, dynamic levels of one or more of 5 personalities: borderline, Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, and sociopathy. These personality traits exist in everyone, but are essential for effective leadership. The GreyScale is a two-tailed test that identifies both high and low levels of these personality traits in leaders. Now let's look at how personalities and other attributes are distributed across the population. Let's imagine we're talking about a physical attribute such as height, and we mapped everyone in the world from shortest to tallest. What we wouldn't see is an even distribution on a linear scale. What we would see is this. Height would be distributed on a bell curve with most of the population sitting around the midpoint in terms of being average. But as we move in either direction, we would see people who are very tall or very small. And at the extremes, we would see people who are gigantic and we would see people who are tiny. And if you're very tall but not too tall, you may have advantages in a situation like playing basketball, but you can still function in society. But if you're in the gigantic category, then airline seats and door frames are not your friend, and it's hard to function day to day. Similarly, if you're very short, but not too short, you may have advantages in situations like being a gymnast or a jockey, but you can still easily function in society. But if you're in the tiny category, then there are daily challenges to overcome. And it's similar with personality. Every person has a certain level of personality traits such as narcissism, but some people are average, and some people are higher or lower. It's not evenly distributed on a linear scale across the population. Instead, it's on a bell curve distribution. The GreyScale applies effect size logic to assess how different a leader is from others. But for simplicity, let's stick with the science of standard deviation and start with the average level of narcissistic traits as the midpoint. People with an average level of narcissism are similar to most people in terms of how much they talk about themselves, put others down, and make decisions based on their ego. If we move one standard deviation in either direction, this covers about 68% of the population. So from a leadership perspective, if aspects of your personality fall in this zone, which the GreyScale calls the dilution zone, then your personality traits are unlikely to be noticeably different enough to be an effective leader. You're similar to most people in those traits. And if we move out 2 standard deviations in either direction, this covers another 27% of the population, or 13.5% on either side. Here we see people who are noticeably different, so they stand out as leaders, but are not so different as to be unrelatable, toxic, or dysfunctional. We refer to these as dynamic zones, where a leader is different enough, but not too different, so they are relatable and effective as a leader. As an example, a leader who's dynamically high in narcissism might be seen as someone who is confident being in the spotlight and facing big challenges, but they are not way too different or extreme in terms of their personality traits. They are leaders who get things done and people want to work with. Now, if we look at someone who falls 3 standard deviations from the average and is in the top 2.5% of people, they may be perceived as dangerously different or toxic. They're so different, they might be seen as a totally self-absorbed leader who hogs the spotlight and deliberately puts others down to build themselves up. The whole thing is a little bit like an operating temperature. If the leader runs really warm or dynamic, people notice it in a positive way. But if they run way too hot or dangerous, then they can be toxic and their teams suffer. Moving in the other direction, we see people who sit in the other dynamic zone and are lower in narcissism. So they're more likely to stand out as leaders because they are less self-interested, they put their team in the spotlight, and give them lots of credit. However, people in the lowest 2.5% and in the danger zone are way too low in narcissism. They are likely to be extremely different and fail to function in business as they aim to be a saint and save everyone, which makes it difficult to make the tough decisions leadership often requires. The GreyScale helps leaders understand their operating temperature and where they're different across 5 essential personalities. It tells leaders where they may be diluted and unlikely to have noticeably effective leadership traits. It tells them where they might be dangerously high or dangerously low and potentially toxic and dysfunctional. But most importantly, It tells them where their personality traits are dynamically high or dynamically low, making them noticeably different and effective, with unique thinking and behaviors to suit the situations they lead in.